Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you also for putting this together, because we have some fantastic panelists right here, who are my pleasure to introduce. First, I have here Miloš Balac, and he is an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker specializing in stories at the intersection of sports, pop culture, and politics. And then next to him, we have Kavita Menon, and she is the Chief Communications Officer for Doctors Without Borders. And then last, we have Andrew Seaman, and he is the editor-at-large for jobs and career development at LinkedIn, and he's also the editor of the popular Get Hired newsletter, which if you haven't subscribed yet, you probably should subscribe. I'm sure that he'll be putting in a push for that. He also serves as the vice chair of our Columbia Journalism Alumni Board. So I'm going to start here with Miloš and ask him, so what career path did you originally envision for yourself, and how has it evolved to what you're doing now?
That's a good question that I don't know that I ever had a clear vision. Maybe if you asked me when I was 10, it would have been to be a dolphin trainer or something like that. I always look back on my career sort of from where I am now, and it all seems like a series of happy accidents that make a lot of sense in the rear view. Even coming to Columbia J School, you know, a lot of my fellow friends from my year had their sights set on coming to Columbia J School because they knew what they wanted to be. For me, it was more that I knew my affinities were for journalism. I wrote for the school paper at my university. I always liked making films, music videos. I had a radio show, and I had a good friend's sister who had gone here, who I met one summer before my senior year of college, who was like, "Oh, you should go to Columbia Journalism School." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And then I looked into it and I applied, and from there it all just made sense. So, you know, I think where I am now, I'm very happy with my career and I love it. But if you had asked me even when I was at Columbia, I wouldn't have known that this is what I would be doing.
And so tell us a little bit about what you are doing. And one of the shows I think that a lot of people here might have recently watched. So please tell us just some of your recent things that you've been involved with.
Sure. I spent 3 years living in the UK working on a series that was on Hulu and FX called Welcome to Wrexham. And most recently, I was the showrunner for a series on Netflix called Polo, which is another multi-part sports doc series. And right now, I have a few projects in development, figuring out what the next big one will be.
So Kavita, how about you? What career path did you originally think that you would go down, and how did that evolve? And also even tell us what you studied at the J School.
Yeah, it's so funny. I also feel like, in retrospect, this all kind of makes sense, but at the time it evolved pretty organically. I also totally fell into journalism in undergrad. I went to undergrad at UC Berkeley, and I wanted to be a DJ at the radio station, but at Berkeley, like, everybody wants to be a DJ, and so you have to work for a semester to prove yourself before you can actually, you know, kind of even take the first step into the DJ booth. So I volunteered in the newsroom, and then I just got completely hooked, and I was always on a path to go to law school, but I ended up really falling in love with journalism, and so I applied to journalism school on a lark and ended up thinking, oh, it's a great idea to move to New York City, and the J School program is also really efficient. At that time, it was 9 months, you know, I would have a master's, but I never really knew, and I had a broadcast background, so then I wanted to do print long-form concentration, but it so happened, and then also I focused on urban issues, like I was really interested in housing policy and homelessness and, you know, kind of all of these like very city gritty issues, and you know, my career has taken a completely different path. I've done much more international affairs work. My first real job out of journalism school was at WNYC at On the Media. So even then, kind of journalism adjacent, like looking at journalism and society and the intersection of media and culture and politics. So I couldn't have planned any of that, but it's been a series of pretty happy coincidences.
So I think for sure a theme that we're going to keep hearing is being open to opportunity and just sort of seeing, like, you know, where your skills are and just being open to all sorts of great things coming your way. Just tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, about your role.
So now I'm the Chief Communications Officer for Doctors Without Borders, which is a humanitarian organization. We work in more than 70 countries around the world providing medical aid, humanitarian aid. And I started working there in 2017 as the editorial director. And so Doctors Without Borders, for people who don't know, was founded by journalists as well as doctors. And the idea was to provide direct aid, but also to report on what's driving these needs and to really expose humanitarian issues, abuses, discrimination, persecution. It's really had, these kind of high mission, this kind of journalistic mission and ethos that was really attractive to me, kind of going in. So we invest in reporting as well. We have like an international network of field producers and communications officers who gather testimonies of, staff, patients, people in the community who are talking about, what are the medical needs, what are the political issues, and we report that out. We also have a big fundraising department, but we keep the fundraising communications is a little bit separate. I mean, I also have a hand in that, but that's not my team. So, just to say that there is an attempt to keep some kind of quasi-journalistic independence. Like I don't call myself a journalist anymore. I'm clearly a communications officer and I'm responsible for public relations for the organization, but there still is this kind of mission within the organization to kind of report honestly, independently on what's happening, and also to be really self-critical. Like that's kind of part of the ethos of the organization, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting about the different departments and about how it works. That's fascinating. I hadn't really realized that. For Andrew, for you, we'd love to hear about your journey, how the roles that you started with in journalism, and then now how that led to your current role at LinkedIn.
Yeah. So thanks for having me, J-School. Yeah, so I have a very weird position, but also I feel very fortunate. Basically, after I left the grad school, I had always wanted to be a political journalist, and I was very fortunate that after I left, I went to DC for Reuters, and I got to do that. And the caveat is that this was before Trump even part one. And it was actually quite boring to cover politics because you just sort of sit around, you're stuck in the White House for quite a while and wait for something to happen. And I decided I wanted something a little bit different. So I started covering medicine, which again, I never really expected. It was a little bit of my master's advisor influence there. He was a well-known healthcare reporter. And I worked my way up to be senior medical journalist at Reuters. And that gave me a lot of insight into, I think, what I wanted to do in journalism and communications, which was give people information they could use in their everyday lives. Like, is this good information? Is this important? And once I sort of hit a ceiling with that at Reuters, I went and became their digital editor. And there was some internal stuff going on where they were selling the Thompson part, half of the Thompson part, to a hedge fund. So actually another classmate of mine was at LinkedIn and said, hey, why don't you come over here? And we have a news team. And as digital editor, I had worked with a lot of the news teams at tech companies. And a lot of times they were actually like business development, if anything else. And I really didn't want to do that. Fortunately, what I found out was basically, it's now, I think 13, 14 years ago, they hired a really well-known business journalist, Dan Roth, and just threw him into the mix and said, good luck. They didn't have a plan for him, but he slowly found his way into building an editorial team. And I don't know whose idea it was early on, but we report up into product, not communications. So we really are sort of embedded in the product itself. Comms doesn't tell us what to write. They don't review anything. They'll help us amplify our message and get us out there. But so I'm very happy there. And then in terms of what I actually do now, about a year into my time at LinkedIn, what happened was I was like, it's kind of weird that you have this whole editorial team and you don't do anything for job seekers, because that seems like, a missed opportunity. And I kind of created a job for myself. So I do a newsletter and a podcast, and it's kind of spawned a franchise. There's about 12 of me now around the world, because we have local teams all around the world, and we work with our product to figure out, okay, how can people engage with this content? I work on policy for the feed a little bit, and then on top of that, now with the approach of AI, with sort of the federal layoffs going on, we really look at, okay, how can we help our members? So it's nice to be detached, like I said, from like the comm side of it, but also like the marketing side, and just say like, okay, how can we be of service? And I think that's where the through lines of traditional journalism come in.
Thank you. You know, that's interesting. And I like that you said that one of your jobs was boring, because I think that one of the misconceptions about jobs outside the newsroom when people start exploring is, you know, will they be boring? Because, you know, all of us come to the J School. We love the newsroom. We love the excitement, the breaking news, the people that we work with, sort of all having that sensibility and all that. And so I'm going to turn to Milos, because I think that your experiences have been anything but boring. So sort of, what do you feel is the most interesting thing that you've done outside the newsroom?
Well, you know, since I stopped working in newsrooms, I've just been, I get to travel the world with my work. I think for me, something that I probably won't mimic in any other future jobs, I think my family and girlfriend would be happy if that doesn't happen. But like I said, I lived in the UK for 3 years, which was really kind of, you know, I wasn't living in London. I was living in northern Wales in a small town called Wrexham. I don't know if any of you have seen the program I worked on, but it's about a pretty down on its luck place that Hollywood comes in. Ryan Reynolds bought this soccer team and kind of infused it with all of this Hollywood magic, and we made a project about it that's taken on a life of its own. But that required me embedding in this Welsh community. And what's really funny, I always joke with my journalism school friends, because one of my best friends, still one of my best friends to this day, is Welsh. His name's Thomas Lewis. We met here. And, you know, I think, and then my other best friend from this time was Ben Teitelbaum, who was the sports guy. When we were, here for grad school, he was all about sports journalism. And then I ended up being the one who makes sports films and lived in Wales. And that's just an incredibly special place that I will return to for the rest of my life. That just became another part of my life, another community that I'm in love with. And that, you know, is something that I don't think happens with many jobs, and for me, I don't expect it to happen with many more jobs.
That is pretty cool, I have to say. And also now that I need to watch your show for sure. I have been to Wales once, and it was gorgeous. So I'm very intrigued to see the show. Kavita, what are some of the most interesting and exciting things that you've worked on?
I don't. It's so hard. I should say, like, part of my path also kind of away from classical journalism. My first kind of journalism adjacent job was at the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is an organization founded by journalists to protect journalists, but also to defend and stand up for press freedom. But it's using journalistic skills, the tools and tactics of journalism to expose violations. And, you know, if somebody's jailed for their investigative story, then you make it an even bigger story so that it backfires. And that was really an incredible job, an incredible opportunity. I got to travel all over. I was the Asia program coordinator eventually. And so I got to go to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and met some really amazing, inspiring journalists, like really the best, kind of most, like the bravest journalists who were really kind of challenging their societies and doing really interesting work, and get to kind of support them in some way. But it was also getting to, what was thrilling about that job was also getting to kind of question authorities about what they were doing, and to kind of be empowered to do that, to really like speak truth to power. And that was really just an incredible job. And that's what I think then led me into more of the kind of advocacy realm. From there, I did go back to journalism for a bit. I got the Pew, at the time it was called the Pew Fellowship in International Journalism at Johns Hopkins University, and I did a project in Sri Lanka. So that was my kind of, I was going to go back into journalism, but I really missed the advocacy part of actually doing something about what you uncover. So I ended up from there working at Amnesty International, and had some really interesting experiences, also mostly in Nepal and Sri Lanka. But it is really hard to pick. Like that chapter of my career was just really interesting because I just had so much access to amazing people, amazing work, and kind of the ability to push for things that I really believe in.
And how about you, Andrew? What do you think has been the most interesting thing that you've done at LinkedIn?
At LinkedIn, I think it was, I think everything is like a lot of little steps that come together. Probably around March 2020, something happened. You guys might have been there. But essentially, I came from Reuters. I spent many years as a medical reporter, and then I was doing daily news stuff at LinkedIn and doing the jobs stuff. And this pandemic happened, and I don't think most people have like an embedded healthcare reporter. So I was able to sort of use all of that from my background plus what I had learned at LinkedIn. And really, we worked around the clock to try and figure out, okay, how do we operationalize this, working with the World Health Organization to say, okay, give us good information and we will get it in front of people. And it was a really exciting time. And again, it had that like service component where it's like people need to know this and we have this gigantic platform. So I would say sort of around the pandemic and getting things spun up in terms of like features on the platform, making sure that we could break people's information bubbles because they're not necessarily coming to LinkedIn for news. They are now, but back then it was sort of like, hey, here's information that you might not expect. So I liked doing that. I think that was a highlight.
I mean, much of what you're doing at LinkedIn does sound very close to journalism. I mean, are you still considering yourself a journalist?
I don't actually know how I classify myself anymore. I think journalism has somewhat of a purity problem because it's funny when I spent 4 years as the ethics committee chairperson for the Society of Professional Journalists, and I very much appreciate that because I think to be good at that, you need to really be comfortable with yourself and your own ethics. And it kind of prepared me to make the jump from Reuters, which is, I think, the most traditional of traditional types of journalism, to a tech company. And as soon as I did that, a lot of people that I knew who went to the J School or worked in journalism was like, oh, you're not a journalist anymore. And it was, I had like people in charge of journalism organizations tell me that. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true. And also, I don't think it's a bad thing to have people with journalism training and who are very passionate about good information being elsewhere in the workforce or the labor market. So, yeah. So I don't actually know how how I define myself.
Fair enough. So, Kavita, I think you said earlier, you've already said that you don't consider yourself a journalist, that you feel like you're firmly in the communications camp. But I want to ask you, though, what of your journalism skills, of which you certainly have many, do you find yourself using on a daily, weekly, or even occasional basis?
I mean, yeah, so I don't pretend to be a journalist, but I think I still have journalistic sensibilities, and that is the way that I look at the world. Like, I ask questions, I'm very critical about things. I think I still use a lot of my writing, editing, and judgment, which is, I think, this really essential journalistic skill that is hard to teach also, but I think that is something that we try to cultivate here, is just that kind of judgment, discretion, like how to kind of really evaluate something critically. So I think all of those things, those journalistic skills, can serve you in any number of functions. Like being a journalist can be being a good researcher or analyst, or or if you're into the storytelling, like there are other ways or other organizations where you could share stories about people or the culture, what's happening in the world. Like it depends what draws you to journalism. I think there's so many different kinds of journalists, and there are different ways to carry some of those skills forward into other careers.
And Milos, how do you feel that your journalism skills or sensibility, just even the way you see the world or the way you treat facts, how do you feel that that's help you stand out in a very crowded and competitive field?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we learn at this school is how to be journalists, but for me, sort of building off of what's already been said, I actually do think of myself as a journalist independent of my career, where I would say maybe my work is in journalism always, but it's always journalistic. And I think how I view the world is as a journalist in terms of the values that, I want to uphold. And, Kelly at the beginning was talking about the foundational things that we learned here and the tenets that we learned here, which I try and carry with me. I'm not trying to be on some high horse, but the ethics that we learn, that is how I want to carry myself in anything I do. And I think that's what sets us apart when we're in career or work situations where maybe it's not necessarily journalism and we're not surrounded by other journalists, but I think what we bring to the table is that sort of judgment and ethical viewpoint. For me, I work with I make documentaries, but these days, a lot of people in that world are coming more from TV backgrounds, reality TV, where that ethical consideration is not necessarily part of how they came up in the industry. And I think that's something that is just a no-brainer, and also sort of a line in the sand for me of what is allowed, what isn't allowed in an edit, and things like that. And I think it's also, as this conversation is happening, I think we also have to acknowledge the world we're living in, the campus that we're on. I think this school stands for something that they have thankfully made a point as the faculty of the journalism school and the dean of the journalism school to speak out and support. I wish the wider university would do the same, but it all comes back to feeling like this is where I learned to look at the world that way and really uphold those values.
Andrew, I know that a big part of what you're doing at LinkedIn is helping people with career development and helping people essentially get hired. What advice, like if you could go back and think of yourself as a student at the J School, what advice would you give yourself, sort of looking back?
There'd be a lot of stuff about student loans, but aside from that, I think it would be to be open more to different possibilities, because I think when I was here, I had that very narrow vision of like, okay, this is what you do after this, and I'm very appreciative of Dean Cobb, because I think he has a much wider aperture for like, okay, this is what you could do journalism with. So I would say be more willing to experiment with like, where you want to go and what you want to do.
And how about you, Kavita?
Yeah, I think that's great advice, to be open and be open to experimentation, especially right now as there's so many changes happening in the media world and in the world at large. Like, we can't predict really what things are going to look like a year or 5 years or 10 years from now. And I mean, that's only accelerated, but I graduated a long time ago in 95, and the next year everything went digital. Like we were still splicing tape in the radio room my year. So that was felt like a very transformative shift. But this is another one of those like really big transformative shift times. And I think I learned so much from my peers, like I would say as much or maybe even more so than my professors at the time. So really, I would say just keep your networks, your peer networks alive, because I think that will continue to be true. This is one of the big gifts, I think, for me of the journalism school, was that my network, my professional, personal networks, like these are still my closest friends, and I've learned so much and kind of been exposed to so much through them, through my classmates. So yeah, I would say just enjoy each other and like keep following each other through your careers.
And how about you, Milos?
I think everything's been said. It's hard to really build upon that, but it really is that sense of just be open to what the opportunities and possibilities could be. And also, I think there were some students at my time who were maybe more willing to break the quote unquote rules in terms of like, what are we even thinking about, talking about, where I remember Occupy Wall Street was happening while I was a student here. And one of my classmates, Andrew Katz, who's now a pretty renowned photo editor at The New Yorker, he was all over Twitter, and he was down there and he was reporting. And for all of us, we were like, what is Twitter? What are you even doing? And I think the school was not dismissive of it, but a little like, we don't know what that is, and hesitant to really push us all to follow his lead. And I think, to your point, it's like you learn a lot from your peers. And even the people who aren't your year, they're Columbia Journalism School alums all around you. I mean, my friend Brooke, got to shout her out, is in the front row. We sat next to each other for many years at my first job, which was at the Huffington Post. And she's an alum, not from my year. And we had a lot of fellow colleagues and now very close friends who also went to the J School. So it's a network of people that become like family and have each other's backs.
And Andrew, how are you tapping into the alumni community, like for career opportunities, or even just in general?
Yeah, so all of my jobs actually come back to the J School because, my friend who worked at LinkedIn, he's still there with me. I would say there's about 10 to 11 of us from the J School on the editorial team at LinkedIn. In fact, the person who's in charge of our AI efforts, not for all of LinkedIn, but for the editorial side, he's a J School grad. Yeah, and I think there is this really nice sense of community, especially when you talk about like what you did here, because it has been so prescribed for so many years that I don't know, it's just this nice little club to be in, so you kind of help each other out maybe a little bit more than you would have otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. How about you, Kavita?
I haven't been making as much use of my kind of professional networks from the journalism school recently, but my first jobs definitely came through the journalism school. I mean, we talked before, we have a friend in common. Many people have Srinath Srinivasan in common, but he's the one who told me about the job at the Committee to Protect Journalists. I think even at WNYC at On the Media, that also came via a professor at the journalism school. I was just in the hallway, like, I think in the career development office, kind of asking for leads, and somebody overheard me and kind of mentioned that they were looking for an assistant producer. So, it's like you never know when it's going to lead to something. And then I worked, when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists, I worked under Ann Cooper, who some of you also know. She was a professor of international journalism here, former NPR foreign correspondent for many years, and she was amazing. And she was really my mentor at CPJ. And then I taught RW1 with her one year, which was that is one of the highlights of my career. It was really a great opportunity to it felt like a full circle moment. But yeah, in recent years, because my career has moved a little bit away from journalism, this is the first time I've been kind of invited back to speak on this. And I think thinking even about my career as journalism adjacent is kind of interesting to reflect back. But
well, Milos, yours, I think that a lot of people here, they don't even know how to get into the documentary world. So I just feel like that's even a little bit further departure, I think. So how does one even break into it? How did you find these opportunities?
I mean, my story is funny, and it's a much longer story that I'll make very short. But like I mentioned, I was working at the Huffington Post. That was my first job out of the J School. I actually got it at the career fair. There was another alum who came representing HuffPost Live, which at the time was a new venture that was just going to launch. And I worked there very happily for 4 years. It was this kind of cutting edge, very cool thing many moons ago, not the Huffington Post of today. And after I left that job to go work with some other former colleagues on a late night talk show, that was just sort of a natural progression where people that I had been working with had this opportunity and brought me with them. But while I was there, ever since I was a kid, New York Magazine has been my homepage. And there was just a news item in the Vulture blog that Amazon Prime to produce Novak Djokovic documentary series. And I'm Serbian. And so I was like, oh, that's cool. Can't wait to watch that. And then I clicked on the story and read a little bit more, and it said that it was from the producers of Chef's Table, which many of you probably know from Netflix, and at the time was very cool and new. And I was like, who's making this? I need to be part of this. And I just dug a little deeper and found the director's name and sent a cold call email and was like, hey, here's who I am. I'm Serbian American. I know this guy. I'm trained as a journalist. My work has been all of this. I did not have any formal documentary experience. Obviously, I had my training here and the work that I did at the Huffington Post. And then the story becomes much longer, but to make a long story short, I got that job. And it required me leaving New York with less than really 2 weeks' notice and taking a large pay cut, but it changed the course of my whole career. So, just go for it.
That's great advice. So just go for it. So Andrew, I'm going to put this question to you. So I think all of us, worked in traditional journalism for several years, for a decade. But what advice would you give? Because seeing as I think that we have some students in the audience, to people who are hearing and they're already thinking of newsroom adjacent?
Yeah, honestly, I think so. I spend my life kind of looking at data about the labor market, the workforce, and talking to people much smarter than I am. And honestly, I think everyone's going to be in the same boat eventually, where there is never going to be a stable career as we knew it, as our parents or grandparents knew it. And I'm not saying that to scare anyone, but it is scary. So I think the key is, and I use this term, it sounds kind of weird, but to think of yourself as a basket of skills and realize that you can wield those in different ways. And I think what you learn in journalism at the J School, after J School, they're incredibly powerful tools, and they're things that will take a while to replicate, if ever. AI, they're going to obviously keep working on it. It's going to keep getting more advanced. It's going to take time. So it's really important to be intentional about your career, strategic, but also somewhat creative. So whether you're in school, freshly out of school, or been out of school for like 30, 40 years, as long as you want to be in the workforce, I think that's going to be the recipe moving forward. Based on everything I've seen and I've read, I think that's going to be the recipe for success.
Do either of you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, what I think I would just like to say is, obviously we're talking about my last few years of my work, but there was a period in which I was sort of bouncing back and forth between newsroom jobs and working in the field in documentaries, and then coming back to a newsroom position, which is all to say that I also think, to what Andrew was saying about journalism sometimes has a purity problem, I think you can also fight back against that and still find your way back to journalism. I don't think it needs to be this cut and dry, do I have a newsroom career, do I not? I think that's also something that can be flexible and evolve throughout your career, and there are different seasons for the different skills that we all have.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. People are you in or are you out? But I mean, it's sort of doesn't have to be permanent either way. And especially as Andrew just said, with things being so turbulent as they are and probably will continue to be. Kavita, how do you think that that AI is sort of affecting these newsroom adjacent jobs? And newsroom jobs, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not the best person to answer that question. I would punt that. But to add to what was said already, I don't know whether anybody goes in thinking like, I want a journalism adjacent career. It's more like, for me, I came into journalism because I'm very curious. I loved the opportunity to just ask anybody anything about anything, and to kind of pursue that professionally seemed like a dream. And so when I was kind of looking at different career options, it was really like, is this interesting? And then also like, does this have the potential for some kind of social impact? And gradually over the course of my career, I think the social impact part has kind of won over, and I really am interested in that aspect. But I think if you just kind of ask yourself these questions of like, is this an interesting path? You don't have to figure out your whole career. You just kind of have to figure out the next step, one step at a time, because things are moving so fast. So I would say don't also put so much pressure on yourself to like figure out the whole thing, because I just don't even think that's possible these days. You have to be kind of agile and nimble.
I think that's great advice. And now we're going to open it to questions. You could just come right to the microphone and form a line, whoever would like to ask the first one.
Hello. Is it working?
There's a little switch. Just push it up.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I'm currently a student here at the J School, and I have a question for Kavita, which is, can you give us a comparison of working in a newsroom versus working in the humanitarian-intergovernmental sector in terms of the pace, the lifestyle, the work culture? And also, Liz, if you're willing to share your story as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so the only time I really worked in a newsroom was at WNYC. That's way, way, way back. And it was still a weekly show, so it wasn't like it wasn't like a wire service, for example. Whereas actually right now at Doctors Without Borders, some days it's like a wire service, because we are trying to kind of figure out what's happening in so many different countries. There are so many big emergencies every day. We produce original content. We also curate stories from around our comms network. And so we actually do have a little kind of newsroom mini meeting every day to kind of talk about what's the top story, what's relevant to what's happening in the US, or what just is a neglected crisis that we need to draw attention to. So we do have these kinds of meetings about what do we want to push out on the web, on social, like all of those kinds of things every single day. So in a way, it's a little bit more fast-paced, but it's not a traditional newsroom. But a lot of the people who work there also come from newsrooms, come from journalistic backgrounds. So we still kind of go through those motions and go through that practice.
Sure, yeah. So I'll just say, so immediately after journalism school, I got my start at Fortune Small Business. So that was sort of a subset of Fortune magazine, but focused on small business. And it was really great and, really writing and reporting, just a lot of great stories there. And then, just went on to a couple of different editorial roles, including at abcnews.com. And then I would say that my last sort of clear editorial role like that was with Zagat. People may remember they were sort of the restaurant survey, and I was a senior web editor there, and it was all about creating content. So I guess in a sense, maybe that was more of a hybrid role, sort of putting me into that, because that was not exactly traditional journalism, although it was about dining news. But it was also sort of already the term content was sort of being thrown about and creating content that was behind the paywall. Content in front of the paywall. Then after that, I got into social media because I had a blog, and because I had to publicize the blog, I became an early adopter of social media. And then here I came back to the journalism school working with Sri Srinivasan as his adjunct. He was teaching smarter social media. And so then I was doing social media consulting and teaching here. So then I sort of done that pivot. And then I was a social media editor at NBC New York. And then I was, just by being open to just amazing opportunities, landed with Richard Atias and Associates, where I'm now the communication director. And so if you're not familiar with RANA, it's a global communication firm that does a lot of very impactful platforms and summits, including the Future Investment Initiative and the FII Priority Summits. Do we have who wants to ask the next question? Okay, great.
Thanks for sharing your stories, and I loved hearing what you took from traditional journalism and to your current roles. If you were to go back to a traditional newsroom, let's say, having these experiences outside of that, what would you take to a newsroom now? And related question: do you see, looking from the outside in, any blind spots with the current traditional news landscape?
I can actually, because when we get new members of our team, I actually give them kind of a weird anti-pep talk. I don't know how to explain it, actually. Basically, when someone comes from a traditional newsroom and joins the team, a lot of times what I tell them is that they will get very frustrated very quickly, because even though we have an editorial team filled with former journalists and whatever they're calling themselves, we call ourselves editors internally. But what I'll say is, in most newsrooms, they're looking for what works and will stick with that for as long as possible. In a tech environment, they're looking for whatever works this week. And basically, as soon as you get a project up and running, you should be looking for what comes next. And what I always tell them is, you're going to get very frustrated, but that is a feature of this world, not a bug. So I think that's something that actually traditional newsrooms can learn from too. I think they look for solutions maybe a little bit too late, and they also look for things that are going to have staying power, but I don't think there are many of those around, if any. So you need to sort of, it's almost like just swimming. You just got to keep going. So that's what I would say.
It's a really hard question to answer. It's a great question, but I'm trying to think, and I don't know. It is a different beast. I'm thinking back to, even when we worked together at the Huffington Post, what was something that happened that more legacy today wasn't legacy then, but more traditional news organizations, is that I think there was this moment in time where everyone was trying to figure out how to monetize again. And so I remember having to switch gears nonstop from now we do Facebook Live to now we do YouTube to now we do this. And it was very discombobulating and ultimately unsuccessful for multiple brands, not just where we worked. And it was a strange time in media that I feel like we all weathered. And I think what we've seen is that the organizations that maybe just find their own niche and really commit to it have been more successful. And I think from the outside looking in, it's about that of maybe not being so reactive while still being very quick to adapt, if that makes sense.
I'll just say that one thing that's interesting now is to see this sense of social mission in journalism. Like, I think there are a lot of media organizations and a lot of journalists who are feeling like a profound sense of responsibility and, and like kind of mission driven work to, kind of as a pillar of our democracy and our civil society. And it's a noticeable shift also from when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Like, we always have had a strong network of support among American journalists, U.S. journalists. But now I think it's much greater sense of solidarity and kind of a common purpose. And I think, you alluded to what's happening right now, at Columbia University, at the journalism school. I think for journalists to really kind of step up to that, kind of the highest ideals of the profession and fight for these ideals within their organizations or as freelance, as, independent journalists, like this is really urgent right now. So I hope that is, and I do see that in many places being carried forward. So, and certainly if I was returning back to the newsroom, I hope I would bring that fire with me.
Hi, can you hear me? Perfect. I have two questions, I'm a Columbia alum, class of 2010. My name is Carmen. My first question is for my friend Andrew. With everything happening in the world and certainly in the United States, how do you determine what's the most important LinkedIn news? Because I definitely go to that first in the morning. And then my second is for Kavita. I saw that Doctors Without Borders had made a statement about USAID after the funding was after everything happened. I kind of wonder if Doctors Without Borders has taken on some of the mantle of doing some of the work that USAID can no longer do. Thank you.
As for how we determine what's important, it's local editors, so people who are journalists, have been trained by journalists. There's definitely computer algorithms or whatever that are somewhat involved, but for the most part, it is just people in the local markets. So that's one of the reasons we actually have such a large team is like, we have people in India, we have people in Singapore, we have people in Australia. We don't want to be the United States deciding what's important for other countries. So those local editors are making editorial decisions about what they're going to put at the top, what banner they're going to put at the top, and also what's going to lead the daily rundown.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, we spoke out about the cuts to USAID more because of the impact that it's having on the aid sector as a whole. So Doctors Without Borders doesn't accept U.S. government funding, and that is to preserve its independence and neutrality as a humanitarian organization. But U.S. funding is like 40% of the humanitarian sector, 40% of global health funding. So it is the single biggest funder of humanitarian health programming. So it has huge impacts. So even though it's not impacting Doctors Without Borders projects directly, of course, like we work in the aid ecosystem, and it affects like referral hospitals, ambulances, clinics, a lot of the organizations that we work with. So we've been saying no single organization can actually fill the big hole that is left. There's a lot that was wrong about the U.S. dominated aid sector, and certainly there could be a lot of restructuring, but the way this is happening, like the speed, the scale with which this is happening is causing a lot of damage and a lot of suffering for affected communities. So we're still grappling with all of this, like what are the impacts? And one of the things we are working on, like I'll be part of an international meeting next week to talk about how do we report out on the impacts and what kind of medical data can we collect over time also to document what are going to be the longer term impacts of these funding cuts. So that's also kind of an interesting thing to think about, like how do we apply these journalistic skills to documenting this kind of with facts and evidence and not just kind of polemics.
Great, please go ahead.
Tom Watkins, 84. Same question Carmen had, but vis-a-vis WHO. Presumably there are cutbacks there with Trump's pullback of U.S. aid, and has that affected either the way you do business or the kinds of business you're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's also, for us, the biggest impact of the U.S. pulling out of the World Health Organization is the lack of kind of information sharing and knowledge that, I mean, the WHO is a really critical forum for that, for kind of gathering as a clearinghouse for knowledge and information, right, about like the next pandemic, for example. And so we also did, I mean, so Doctors Without Borders tries to kind of stand apart a lot of the time, and we don't often kind of speak in coalition with other organizations or on behalf of the World Health Organization as a UN agency. We often can be even very critical of the World Health Organization, but there's no question that the US pulling out of the WHO weakens the WHO and weakens all of our ability to kind of be alert to what are the next health threats and what are the current ones even. I mean, you may have heard a lot, there's been a lot in the media about the Ebola outbreak right now, and what do we know about it, the US not sending its experts over there, and so we're then blind to these threats that are out there, and we know disease knows no borders, and so this affects all of us. But
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I was really impressed by the discussion of your professional identities. I thought it was very thoughtful. And I just want to push it a little bit farther and ask you, Kavita, this is a situation you may have actually been in. It's a hypothetical, but let me just push it. If you're a doctor or a nurse and you're in a remote place and a bomb goes off, your role is unambiguous. Your training kicks in and you do what you do. What about you? I mean, have you been in that situation, or is it analogous?
I mean, if you're saying the training is if you see something, do you first act as a reporter?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is kind of like Milos answered this question a little bit of like, this is kind of how I feel I exist in the world. Like, I want to know what's happening and why it's happening and kind of interrogate a few layers down. Like, what is this? How do we know that? You know, kind of fact checking things is kind of just the way that I think about stuff. So I think you don't necessarily, you know, for me at least, like I can't turn that part of my brain off no matter what my title is or like what my function is in an organization. I do think that is the way I go about the world. I ask a lot of questions. I can be really annoying, but yeah, I ask a lot of questions.
Are there tensions or conflicts?
Yeah, I think so. Like, it's interesting, even within Doctors Without Borders, for example, like, I think, you know, even when we're doing media relations, I think because a lot of us are also ex-journalists, like, we know part of our job is to protect the reputation of the organization, but I am always sympathetic to the journalist and like their questions, and sometimes even if, you know, so we try as much as we can to be, and we have transparency, accountability, like a lot of these also journalistic principles are also part of our mission statements, but sometimes things that we can't resolve publicly, I will continue to try to interrogate that internally, you know, and try to like raise those questions. So I try to, I think, carry some of this kind of, I don't know, that professional sensibility even within the organization. I mean, not, you know, I try at least.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to ask a question. This is a little bit more about like advice. So I've always been interested in entertainment ever since I was a student at the J School. That's all I really cared about, not the New York Times or any of the other stuff. I did utilize, and I still do, the skills that I got from being a student at Columbia. But I guess I'm trying to figure out how to take my entertainment journalism career to the next level. So I'll be terse because I'm a little verbose. But I do a weekly entertainment news segment for 94.3 WYBC. So I reside in Connecticut. I came from there, took the train. So I also cover film festivals. So like, for example, I covered Sundance a couple of months ago, got a chance to interview Dave Franco on the red carpet. I'm interviewing Karina. She's a Mexican actress. Her film premiered at South by Southwest. I've covered Tribeca. I'm going to be covering it again. So it's like, you know, things are going well. I'm making progress. I'm interviewing actors, celebs. All of that is good. But I want to take my career to the next level because I've been doing this segment for the last couple of years. So now I feel like I'm stuck in a rut. It took me a while to actually figure out how to proceed because the J School couldn't really help me when it came to like entertainment journalism. And then I was told that you are, or well, you were, I should say, a showrunner. So was it Kavita? I was told. Okay, so they told me the wrong information. Sorry. So I was told, well, I guess you're the showrunner. So I was hoping that maybe you can give me some guidance on how to proceed and just take my career to the next level because, like, you know, I'm ready to be a star. So I need some advice.
Well, I guess it depends what that next level looks like to you. How are you designing that in your head?
So ideally, you know, I would love to work for like TMZ or another big entertainment news outlet. I do want to be in front of the camera. That's the reason why, like when I do my interviews for at film festivals, I'm in there interviewing the celebrities, right? And I'm putting that out, putting it on social media. It's getting played at the radio station. So I don't mind continuing the path of radio if it'll eventually help me, you know, be like a big entertainment journalist, you know, like working for E! News or somewhere. I'm just throwing it out there. So I guess I'm just trying to figure it out because it's unconventional. So it's the path that I'm traveling.
Sure. I mean, I'm not on a similar path, but I can say that from what I would say is similar is that after a certain point in the early part of my career, I wasn't looking for job opportunities to present themselves to me so much as sort of designing them for myself and claiming them. You know, I've told a short story of a much longer story where I kind of saw that an opportunity could possibly exist, so I made it exist by just not being afraid to reach out to people. I think that's also a key skill we learn here is how to communicate in our daily life and how to reach out to people in a way that is both respectful and still showing off who you are. You know, people are impressed, frankly, when they hear Columbia Journalism School. It still carries water, and I think it's about, you know, networking and designing what it is you want your career to look like, and then not waiting for that to be like, oh, you know, apologies, Andrew, but I saw on LinkedIn an opening for this exact job. It's more about, you know, go to LinkedIn and find the jobs that are maybe moving in that direction, talk to the right people, and it can hopefully take you where you want to go.
And the follow-up on that, networking is key. So that's one thing I've been doing, especially going to the film festivals, because that gives me an opportunity to network with people who are more in the film industry and reaching out to people. I just guess I got to continue the grind, and sometimes it takes people years, and see what happens. Thank you.
Well, how's your social media presence?
My social media presence is okay. It's not too bad. I still need to work on it. Like, have over 3,000 followers on TikTok. Twitter is over 6,000, and so forth. So I guess I got to continue to build it up. I tweet, post, I do all of that. But, you know, I've met this one actress who I know, Jari. And she told me it took her 6 or 7 years to amass over 100,000 followers. So I've met people with large social media who have a large social media presence, and one thing they talk about is it could take years, so it's not overnight. So that's why I still keep working at it and hanging on for dear life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is also about show running. What is being a showrunner? If you can describe it, and maybe how it's different from being like a documentary, like a more traditional journalist. And then I do have a second question, actually, for Kavita and Andrew. Do you ever work with journalists like in traditional newsrooms? Like why or why not, and how do you think about it?
Sure, that's a good question about what is a showrunner. I'm essentially the main producer of a project. I work on series, so a show, and I just have to oversee sort of a creative vision from start to finish and make it cohesive. I work with, I'm typically actually the director as well of my projects, but sometimes I'm working with directors, I'm working with a whole crew. So I'm kind of both the logistical head of a production, but also the creative head, and kind of uniting, again, all the skills that I really did learn here of, how, from the basics of like what equipment you're gonna use to how you're actually gonna tell the story and edit it.
And we have a media team, and that works closely with journalists. And journalists either pitch us because they want to visit our projects, or they need a play. They're exploring a story and want to visit. Sometimes they need to be hosted in some, like if it's a war zone or just a place recovering from a natural disaster. So sometimes journalists come to us, and then also we pitch journalists all the time to cover the neglected emergency in Sudan, for example, or malnutrition emergency in Yemen. So yeah, we're pitching stories all the time and work with journalists in that way.
Yeah, and we sort of treat them as partners. So I actually have a call tomorrow with an organization just to see like, hey, how can we come together to help like this segment that's sort of affected by ongoing instability in the workforce. And then we have actually back channels with most newsrooms, like hundreds at this point, to if there's a breaking story, if we can go to them and say, hey, can you post something on LinkedIn, so that way we could feature it and members can post their thoughts and their comments. Or if there's like an investigation that a newsroom does, they'll send it to us via that back channel and say, hey, we're doing this really big piece, would you be interested in featuring it somewhere? And also just if they need help. And then obviously we have comms people somewhere else in the building that works with them. But yeah, we see them, at least on the editorial team, more like partners, because we kind of ran toward news as other platforms ran away, because you need to know, like, if the government pulls, US aid or something, that's vitally important to an industry. So from a professional angle, that's important to us.
I think we have time if we can be quick with these two questions, because then we have networking in the back with some refreshments. So I know that we don't want to miss that, but if we could just have two quick questions, then I think we'll wrap it up and then move on to the networking.
Hi, Ayana Renzi, class of 2017. So my two quick questions is just, when you left journalism and went into a journalism adjacent career, did it feel like starting all over? I think that's my biggest hesitance of, I'm interested in doing, exploring opportunities that are adjacent to journalism, but I'm also worried about starting all over after I've worked so hard to build up my journalism career to this point. I currently work as a news producer for MSNBC. And then my second quick question is specifically for Kavita. I hope I said your name correctly. You were saying that there are a lot of different organizations where you can use journalism skills, like you mentioned, if you're passionate about storytelling, you could do that in different ways. And so I'm just wondering, like, Milos spoke to this a little bit, but just like, how do you find those opportunities? I know part of it is like creating opportunities for yourself, but since I feel like so siloed in journalism, it's like I don't even really know where to start in terms of like creating those opportunities for myself.
Well, I could take the first one quickly, which is I wouldn't think that necessarily like that you would be starting at the bottom, because I think, as we've all been saying, your journalism skills would be really prized by an organization. So, I would think, you could look at that as a way to take the next step, or sort of to take a parallel step. But it is true, though, that especially in the roles of communications, they can really vary. So a lot of what I do, so I actually started it in my current role in social media. So that had a lot of similarities, basically to what I was doing leading up to that role, but also I feel to what we do in journalism, because a lot of what we do is really of what I do is these sort of short, newsy videos. So I was indeed, writing and reporting those. So I think, as we've said, it's just all about parlaying your skills and, hopefully using that to take the next step upwards. If you're going to go adjacent, you don't just want to go over, but hopefully you'll be able to go over and up. But that said, though, communications means a lot of different things. So, there could be them things that you haven't had exposure to. I would say, especially maybe if they're, more typically like media relations and that type of thing. But I do feel that probably with your skills, you probably have a lot of great skills that a lot of organizations would love to have. And now I'll let Kavita take that next question.
Yeah, I think it sounds, so you're a visual journalist, a video journalist, and this is the way that people share stories now, so any organization, private companies, educational institutions, like there are so many organizations that would be lucky to have somebody with your background to help share kind of news and stories about what they're doing. So I think it's about identifying, are there topics that are interesting to you or organizations you follow that you think you could lend your skills to outside of a newsroom. But I think visual media, if you're a visual media professional these days, like that is, that's worth a lot. So yeah, know your worth as far as that goes. And I think for me, when I, so I was kind of going back and forth between journalism and, press freedom advocacy for the most part. And then when I went to Amnesty International as a kind of a human rights advocate, researcher, campaigner, that's when I felt like, okay, I can't really go back to journalism at this point. Like I've kind of crossed a line. And that is a scary feeling, because I always wanted to keep that option open, because I do, again, I like in my heart, I feel like I am a journalist. I was proud of that. So that was scary for me, but it was ultimately like, I felt like it was really interesting work, and I just wanted to follow that thread.
Thank you so much. Now I'll take our last question for the evening.
Thank you. Hello. I also come with two questions, but they're super quick questions again. I'm really sorry. So I'm Chi. I'm doing the data program right now at the J School. The first question I have is that apart from engagement data, what are the other types of data that you utilize at your job? And the second question is that how do you build trust for a brand or a company versus building trust in a newsroom? Before, like, in the J School, we get taught we have to have fact checkers and etc. to build trust. So I would love to have your answers on these two questions. Thank you.
Andrew, I feel like you will have a lot to contribute to that.
Yeah, so on both counts, at a tech company, that's one of the actual amazing things that I like. Is that we can measure pretty much anything. So for every project, we try and pick, what is the most important metric to us. And then, we'll see how we move that. We'll conduct experiments. I have this poor data scientist that I bother every day, and unfortunately I know where he sits. But yeah, so basically, we try and figure out what's going to be the most beneficial to us, and also show that what we're doing is beneficial for our members. And we just watch it, and sometimes it takes a little while. We do have like what we call core 4, which is metrics for the entire platform, but it really depends on the specific project. So if it's something related to jobs, it might be job weekly active users is what we call it, and then we have weekly active users just in general. So yeah, so those are the metrics we use. The thing that we always say, especially in the journalism area of LinkedIn, is it's a blessing to be able to measure your performance, but it's also a curse because then you're held to it. As for building brand stability, we're actually, like LinkedIn, we're very tied to, if we're the trusted platform and things like that. And then within within that ecosystem, we have LinkedIn News, which is sort of our little editorial banner. And honestly, it's just consistency. Whatever your ecosystem is, you want to make sure that you're delivering on your promise. And for us, it's that kind of our mission aligns with the core mission and vision of LinkedIn, which is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. I've gone through orientation, but it's really just consistency, like showing up every day and saying, listen, this is what you're going to get from us. We're not going to sugarcoat stuff. We're going to give you what we think you need to succeed in your daily life. I think that's just the secret, is just being consistent.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew, Kavita, and Milosh. Thank you so much. And